Tonight we are truly blessed. We have a really important story to look at and hear. And because many of you can personally remember being very tiny infants and children during the Second World War, or had much older relatives tell you about that experience because you are all so young, it is important that we remember and that we learn from that time in our country's history, and that all of the controversy did not occur on other shores, that there were important things, significant things that happened in this country. Mary Kamado is a Japanese American with a fascinating story to tell. I've learned from her this evening. She's also an accountant. She worked for Ford Motor Company for many years and still consults. She's a Michigan person for many, many years, but her story growing up, I think you will find very interesting. And I don't want to steal her thunder, so would you please warmly welcome Mary Kamado.
Good evening, and thank you for having me here today. I was born in California in the San Joaquin Valley area, which is the area between San Francisco and Sacramento, and that is a strictly agricultural area. So naturally, all the Issei's, when I say Issei's, that's our parents, that's first generation. I'm going to call myself a Nisei because I'm second generation. And the Nisei children are third generation, so now you'll know what these terms mean. So all the Issei's, majority of them in that area were farmers at that time. Sorry, I meant to turn this thing on. She's going to have to help me because I don't know how to run this thing. You know,
Here's your clicker. Is that high enough? Can you all see?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
So when they came here from Japan for a better life, like all the other immigrants did, they discovered that when they got to San Francisco, that they were very discriminated because really California did not want any more from China or from Japan coming in. And so when they were discriminated, they could not work the jobs that they wanted to work. They had to take any job that was offered to them. They could not live in the areas they wanted to live. So my dad, when he came here, he started out in Alaska on the railroads. When the railroads were done, he came to San Francisco. And when he found out that there was just nothing for him to do there, he decided he would go down into the valley area. So he started in the celery fields. And in that area, there are little islands. And to grow celery, you have to have an awful lot of water. So he lived on the islands running these camps. So I was born on one of these islands called Bolden Island 1. And when I stopped to think of it, because the islands are no longer there now, when I go to California, I try to go and make my rounds of the areas where I grew up. But the areas have changed so much and they've developed, so there's really nothing for me to see anymore, so that, you know, I can tell other people about the area. And so anyway, when they came here, this was the type of work that they could get. They had to work on the farms, or else some of the people were able to get nursery jobs if they knew anything about plants. And also, the people that knew how to fish in Japan, they were able to come over here and do their fishing. But when the war broke out, the fishermen were the first ones to have their equipment confiscated because they thought that the fishermen would be out in the waters signaling to Japan and helping them out. So the first people that got their property confiscated was these fishermen. And this is a railroad, and my dad started on the railroads in Alaska. This is President Roosevelt that signed the executive order for us to be evacuated. Shortly after the war started, we were told by our town leaders, because they didn't have time to pass out all these flyers or send letters, we had to go to big business places or telephone poles to read the notices on the poles or the business places telling us what we had to do. So the first thing our parents did was they decided that they would keep the kids home from school. Because at that time when we went to school, the school I went to was not just across the street like the schools are today or being bused. We had to walk. and they got worried that something could happen to us on the way to school. So eventually, we didn't go to school because the schools didn't want us in the school system anymore. So finally, about then, President Roosevelt signed the Executive 9066, which meant that we would be evacuated off the West Coast. And so they didn't have these buildings built, and so they decided they would just round us all up and put us in assembly centers, which were the racetracks. And I'm sure most of you here have been at the DRC racetracks, and you know what a racetrack is all about. So my home at the racetrack was the stables. And so I was one of these that went to the DRC quite often, and when I'd go by the stables, I'd laugh to myself thinking, gee, I slept in one of those places at one time. And you know, the people that I would be with, they just thought it was horrible. They never believed me, but I said I did. So I said, that's why I'm sort of laughing whenever I go by these stables. And then about in April, they decided that, well, we would go into these assembly centers. And then by the time August came, they decided they would send us to more permanent camps. And there were 10 of them in total. Most of them were on the West Coast. But the camp I was sent to was one of 2 that was in Aurora, Arkansas. And this is like about 100 miles out of Little Rock. The way we were transported there was through these trains. And at that time, trains were not like the trains that we have today. They were called cattle trains. And they were very uncomfortable and hot. And it took us 4 days and 4 nights, and the 5th day we arrived in Aurora, Arkansas. And when we got there, you know, we thought, my goodness, what is this? There were 41 blocks, and to have 10,000 people housed in that camp, you can imagine how many barracks there were that were built. And these were all black tar-papered barracks. And so in the winter, it was quite cold in these barracks. And so what they did was they decided they would give us pot-belly stoves for each room. And then we had to make sure that the men in the camp had to go out to the woods to cut the wood to burn in these stoves. And so, you know, when you don't have enough men in your house, you're sort of at a loss when you have to do things like that. But my dad was very good about it. Every day he went out and he cut the wood for our family. And there were some families that the elderly parents could not do it. And so some of the younger ones, like my dad, helped out. But he wasn't that young at the time either, but he was very healthy and he was able to help. So when we went to this camp, everything was a communal type of thing. The bathrooms, the showers, the eating facilities, they were all communal. And so we had to be on schedules. And when we were on schedules, if you didn't get to the kitchen in time to eat on your schedule, you had to wait until everybody was fed, and then you could go in the kitchen and eat, and hopefully you had something to eat then. Also, like our washrooms, we had like, in my block in 41, we had like 6 big tubs. So what we had to do, what my mother had to do, was she would wait up half of the night trying to get a tub to wash our clothes. And also, it got to the point where, you know, we didn't have anywhere to hang our clothes once we washed it. So finally, the government decided they would string these lines in the washrooms for us. But that didn't help, because when people washed, overnight, people would go in there and they would steal the clothes, because here we are, we just brought very little in with us, because when the government said we are going to be evacuated, you could only take in what you could carry. And when you're 11 years old, like I was, what are you going to take? You're not going to worry about your clothing or anything. You're going to take like your toys and stuff. And so, thanks to my mother, she was very strong. And she said, well, you know, you can't just take toys, you've got to take clothes, because we don't know how long we're going to be gone. And so the government really did not give us any time limit, week or months or years. And so, of course, kids being kids, you don't listen to your parents too well when you're told to do things. So anyway, she did gather up extra clothes for us. And at that time, the Issei's did not travel much. So there were very few people that had suitcases. Because when they came over from Japan, what they brought were steamer trunks. So you'll probably find that every Issei that was in California had these huge steamer trunks, which we had one in the house, and that's what my parents brought. And so what we had to do was wrap everything up in bath in your bedspreads or your sheets or blankets. And they did tell us that make sure you bring a pan and some utensils. So my mother, she worried about everything, and she managed to pack these things. But she said everything is getting so heavy, so I'm going to have to take these old pots and pans, which were at that time like aluminum, and they were all bent. And when we got to camp and she took these out, I thought, well, Mom, you know, we had better looking pans than that. Why did you have to bring this into camp? But it served the purpose, because when we ate in the camp mess hall, you were only given so much food. And my mother worried that we would probably starve. So the first thing she did was she had my brother go into town and buy this Mrs. Grass soup. And I'm sure all of you see that in the stores today. And she had bought like cases of it. And so she brought that in, and my brother kept saying to her, why are you bringing so many envelopes of soups in the camp? And she said, because, you know, if you have soup, it'll fill you. And, you know, if we don't get any food, at least we can have soup. And so when we went to camp, at night, every night, because we really didn't get that much to eat, every night she would make us a little cup of soup. And that was what sort of held us over until the next day. And so now, when I go to the stores and I see this package of Mrs. Grass's soup, I stand there and I look at it like, you know what, I think you saved a lot of lives. But I would never buy it because I'm so sick of it, really. But, you know, I guess at the time when you don't have anything, it was really good because we really enjoyed it. And in fact, you know, some of the other parents that had children, I guess their parents never thought of things like that. So they didn't bring anything like that into the camps. And so my mother was always handing it out to other parents. And I can remember my older sister telling her, Mom, you know what, if you keep giving it away, we won't have any. And my mother says, well, you're going to worry about today. I don't want to see another child starving, so, you know, we're going to share this. So sometimes it might have just been a couple spoonfuls that we got, but at least it saved us. And so then when we had to use the bathrooms, they were all open. And I can remember everybody standing back, just telling everybody, go ahead, thinking that eventually everybody will use it and then we'll be able to use it and nobody will be around to see us. But you know, I used to kid my friends. I said, you know, we could stand here all day and all night. So I finally said, you just stand guard in front of this stall, you know, and then when you have to go, I'll stand there. And so this is the way our showers were also. And we did the same thing with that. And so, you know, we used to laugh about it when we were in camp as kids. But as we got older, we would talk about it and we'd laugh about it. We'd really have good laughs over what we did as kids because we didn't know any better, I guess. And so anyway, as the days went by in camp, you know, the young people started getting very restless. So we would have, like in Roar, we would have like little riots. But they wouldn't be too big or they wouldn't last too long because the MPs were always around checking us out and they would stop all this. But it's just one of these things that, you know, when you have nothing to do, you get up in the morning, you go to school, because we did have a school, and the teachers that we had were from out of state that had read about the camps, and they decided they would come in and teach the kids because the kids should not have to go without an education. We did have some very good teachers that really had the interest in teaching us. I had a teacher that was from Oklahoma, and she was from the Indian reservation. She was very good to all of us kids. She was an older lady, and she stayed until the very end teaching us kids, and then she returned back to Oklahoma. She had a husband that was a mayor of her town, and she had a daughter, but she felt like her daughter would be taken care of by her husband, so she's coming into camp. And she was very good. She was a very good teacher, and I kept in touch with her until she passed away. And for some reason or other, her and I had gotten along quite well. And so she said to me when I left the camp, she said, I want you to write to me. And she said, we're going to keep in touch, aren't we? And I said, well, yeah, you know, and I thought, well, I don't even know how to write a letter. I've never written a letter, but I'll manage. So I did, when I got out of camp, I did write her a letter, and she got it in camp, but she was still there cleaning up all the schoolwork. And she got my letter, and we started corresponding. Our school system that we had was just benches, And the books and the material that we had in the schools were hand-me-downs from the Little Rock school system. So a lot of the information we had was sort of outdated. But the teachers felt like, well, that was the best we can do because we had nothing else. They had no other books to teach us with. And then as the days went by and everybody was getting restless, we had block leaders in every block that sort of took care of all the problems. They listened to us, and then they went to the ad building and took it up with the administration. And so they asked for a building to be built so that we would have a place to congregate. So every block had a building that was called the recreation building. But again, all we could do was go there and talk to people and meet people because we had no other things to do in the recreation. We couldn't have parties or anything because you didn't have any food to have at the party. We had no music or anything. So eventually, the older people, they decided that they had to have meetings with the administration people. And the leaders said that was their job. Just bring it to my office and I will take it to them. But you know, nothing was happening. So like in my block, I was in 41, like in my block, a lot of the older people started to hound the block leader because they kept saying, you're the block leader, you're getting all the recognition, and you're not even caring about us. So I remember this man, I mean, so plainly, like it was yesterday that I talked to him. And he said, you know, he said, I'm a block leader because nobody wanted it, but I don't know what to do. And so I said, well, you know what? If we could play games or something in the recreation room, it would help. And also I said, why can't we play baseball and all this that everybody else plays? And so he did take it to the administration building, and finally the government gave us facilities for all that. And so then this rioting sort of quit because now the younger people are kept busy between school and playing basketball and baseball and going to the rec building. So for a while, my mother always said, you know, she said to us kids, I don't want you to go to these places because, you know, she said, you know that some of the people, they lose their temper and, you know, things are happening here. So I had older sisters and older brothers, and it was always a battle between my mother and them because my mother was very strict. Of course, all the Issei at that time, I think, were very strict raising their children. And we had all these do's and don'ts. And so, you know, it was no different when we went to camp. My mother was right on top of all of us girls, especially. The boys she didn't worry too much about, but the girls she did. We had a curfew that we had to be in by, and if we weren't, she made sure she came looking for us. So, you know, when we were growing up, us girls would get together, and we'd say, my goodness, you know, I wonder if all the other mothers are that mean. And I said, I'm sure they are, because I said, you don't see any kids running around after dark. So, you know, so when we were in camp, there were so many things that, you know, we couldn't do simply because our parents were so strict. So then finally, we went to the block leader and we said, you know, if we could have a general store, it might help us because we have nothing other than what we brought in, which was almost nothing. And so if we had a general store to buy goods or, you know, papers and pencils and notebooks and stuff, we can do a lot. And so the government finally decided they would build us general stores in the camp. And luckily, one of my brothers was appointed to be one of the truck drivers. He went out with the MPs every day to buy the stuff for the general store. So we were very lucky because my mother would always give him a list. And so our family had a lot of things that the other families did not have. So eventually the mothers of these other kids that I knew would talk to my mother and ask her if, you know, my brother would buy this. Finally, my brother put his foot down. He said, you know, seems like I'm buying for every family in the camp, and I can't do that anymore because, you know, we have to bring back so much in the Army trucks, and it's usually full. So, Mom, I can't buy for everybody. So my mother said to me, she said, so don't tell your friends that, you know, you'll get it for them. And I said, no, I won't tell them anymore because my brother just decided he wasn't going to do it. So after a while, our living in the camps was not a comfortable living. We had no furniture or anything in the rooms that we had. What furniture we had was what the men found out in the woods, and they put together maybe a chair or a table or something. But other than that, we had cots that the government furnished us to sleep on, because at first we did not have blankets or cots or anything. We had to fill these canvas bags with hay to make a mattress. And so after a while, the government felt that that was not sanitary, so they decided they would give us these army cots. And I think some of you men here, you know what an army cot is. And then they gave us army blankets, because in Arkansas in the winter, it gets icy cold. It just doesn't get cold, it gets icy. And so they decided they would furnish army blankets for us. So in my slides, you will see some of these pictures. And this is the bulletin that went up in all the buildings and on the telephone poles telling us what we were to do and what we could take. And after the war broke out, you will see it, all these signs. The people were posting all these signs wanting to get rid of us. Now this is in the camp. Some of the people that live near the camps, I guess some of the people were able to get in, and this is what they did. And these signs went up all over in California. This is an American farmer that had to post that to protect his own farm, because for a while there in California after the war, there were incidents where people were having drive-by shootings. And the people that had stores, after the war started, they thought, well, they'll try to sell their products or their goods. But it came to the point where the public didn't want to pay for anything. So then the people decided, rather than give it to you, we'll just leave it here, thinking that they were going to go back. But no one got to go back until 3 years. This is where we are being checked to put into whatever barracks that we're going to go into. And in these pictures, you will see that everybody has a tag on, like one of these mailing tags. It didn't matter whether you had a name or not. You had to wear these tags all the time because that was your identification. You had a number, and you know, when they had to check people out, they just connected numbers with the people. And it didn't matter whether you were a child, a grown-up, or a baby, as long as you were of Japanese descent. And as I said, very few people had suitcases. And this is an incident here. And this little girl is in most of the archive pictures. People have asked me where I get these slides. We have a national organization, Japanese American Citizens League. Our national headquarters is in San Francisco, and Detroit chapter is one of the branches of this chapter. And people have always said, we want to know who this girl is. But nobody would come forth to say that's me until about 5 years ago. A lady came out and said, you know, I'm finally going to admit that this little girl that's in all the pictures, that's me. And she was written up in the papers and all, and some of us in Detroit, we sort of laughed because we always said, gee, that looks like a friend of mine, or that looks like somebody that's related to me, and we found out this lady wasn't related to anybody in Detroit. Unless you were very ill, you were not excluded from the evacuation. Like if you were in a hospital like a sanatorium, then they did exclude you until you got well enough to go into the camps. I have a friend that was left behind, and she said, well, you know, she said, being I was in a TB sanatorium, she said, people didn't bother me. They were very nice to me, but she said, I was only there to sleep anyway. She said she slept all the time. And I think this is what happens with people that do have TB. They sleep a lot. When they transported us anywhere, it was always in these army trucks. And I don't know whether any of you have seen army trucks in the Detroit area, but just recently I saw the trucks in Livonia. They have a, I don't know what you call these places, but the people that sign up and they have an office on Schoolcraft, and behind that, between Schoolcraft and Industrial Drive in Livonia, they have a big yard, and I noticed they have a few of these Army trucks parked there. And this is the trucks that are transporting all of our goods, and 9 times out of 10, people got theirs, but there were some incidences where people did not get their bags because they didn't have it labeled properly, or else the tags fell off. Well, this is a couple that's checking in. And all the camps were identical. They were just barracks, and this is Manzanar. Manzanar is in California, and I understand that after the camps were built, San Francisco Chronicle had sent out 2 reporters to document these camps. And so these pictures of the camps are all from the Manzanar camp. This is where we're being checked in. And I probably was one of these in line to take a train, because a lot of places in California, if they were close enough, they were transported by Army trucks. But if you were like in Arkansas from California, you had to be on one of these old trains. And when we were on the trains, I noticed that every time we came to an area where there was an overpass, the guards would run through the cars and they would pull the shades down and they'd close the windows. And you know, and we all sat there wondering why, because it's 100 degrees in these cars. And then when we passed these certain areas, they would come back and they'd pull the shades up for us and open the windows. So, you know, when we got to camp, out of curiosity, I said to one of my brothers, I said, why don't you ask that MP there why they did that? He said, what difference does it make? We're getting off the train. And I said, I know, but I said, why did they do that? Well, he finally asked, and the MP was nice, and he did tell him it was because they were overpasses and we were afraid of snipers. If anybody had found out that this train going through here was Japanese in it, we didn't know what would happen. So that's why we had to pull the shades down and close the windows. And I noticed that it was always when we were coming to an overpass or going under an overpass that they did that. This is a racetrack, and you notice all the fence there? These people are being taken to their stables. The only people that did not go to the stables in my camp was the elderly and the ailing. They were given space in the grandstands where there was a regular roof and all. But the stables that we had, there were no full doors, and luckily California is warm enough at that time, so we didn't have to have complete doors. And then inside the stables, the ceilings are not covered completely, so your neighbor can hear everything you're saying. And this is a cartoon that someone had drawn, and no matter how often you clean the stables, this is what happens. You're never going to get the stable smell out of it. And this is when we first got there, when they furnished these big canvas bags so that you can fill it with hay to make your mattress. And when we went to camp, we had 2 questions on the questionnaires. One was if you would give up your citizenship. And the other ones was would you bear arms to protect the country? And if you said no to any one of these questions, you were sent to a camp called Tule Lake. And Tule Lake was a very strict camp. And eventually they were sent back to Japan. And the sad part of it is, if your parents said no, they would not give up your citizenship, it meant that all the kids had to go as well as the parents. They would not just send the parents back, they sent the whole family back. This is Manzanar, and you might notice what kind of area it's built. And so, you know, even if you wanted to escape, there was just no way you were going to escape on foot. And besides, we had sentries posted on 4 parts of the camp, and they stood up there day and night guarding the camp, and so you couldn't even go near the fence, because in my camp, a little boy, they were playing baseball, and he ran for the ball, and it went close to the fence, and the MP just shot him. And so, you know, we were told that, but you know, being kids, they're kids. I mean, they just didn't pay much attention, and unfortunately, a little boy was shot. This is an aerial view. You can see the tar paper, and if you made a hole in that tar paper, you were out of luck because all the wind went through there and the dust. And when it rained, this was the condition of all the camps because none of the camps were paved. These are the cots that were furnished in the brown gray blankets or army blankets. And if you see anything else, it's because this is what they wrapped their belongings in to bring. Now you might see somebody with curtains or something, where they took their bedspread or something and made curtains. These signs were posted outside of every camp, warning you as far as you can go, and if you go any further, you will be shot. These are children that are pledging their allegiance. And this was our classroom. This was a graduation commencement. And this was our mess hall. The one big problem that we had eating in these mess halls was because the kids, you know, I mean, like myself, I mean, I would go off with my friends and we would never meet our schedule. So it got to the point where the parents were having a lot of problems because they were losing control of us. Because, you know, we would be off and running, and my mother was very lucky to get a job in the mess hall. And every time she served somebody, she looked up to see if it was one of her kids. And she would come home very upset because there was always one or two of us missing. And then when we got back in the line, she was still there serving. And we had to hear it. We really had to hear from her before she even served us. For a while there, the United States government would not allow the Nisei boys to serve in the Army. They said that no, they did not want them in the Army because they were afraid they might be there helping Japan. But the boys became very irritable because what they wanted to do was serve in the Army to show their loyalty. And finally, as the war went on, the government decided to let them join. And they had to be in a segregated unit, which was called the 442nd Infantry. And that was the most decorated infantry that they had. And so all the young fellows, they wanted to go into the service to prove their loyalty. They also wanted to leave the camps to do anything. So there were people that had farms around the camps, and they found out they could get cheap labor. So these guys would go out there to harvest their crops for them. The worst part for the Issei's was the time on their hand. The Issei's really had no outlet. There was nothing for them to do other than go to church on Sundays. And for 2 years, our camp could not have church services. In fact, the government did not want us to congregate anywhere because they thought we might be plotting. And so that's the reason why they did not have a recreation hall for us until everyone started to get so upset. And so they finally gave us a hall to congregate in. And for the Issei's, they didn't go to the recreation halls because, you know, all the young people were there. So all they did was they sat in their rooms and just thought. And so it was so hard for them. And, you know, even if they wanted to work, there was nothing for everybody to do. So, like with my mother, she was very lucky that she got a job in the mess hall. And the pay in the mess hall was $12 a month. And if you had some kind of a education, you might have gotten $14. And if you were a doctor, you got $16 a month. This is where they've gone out and they're harvesting the cabbage for them. After the war stopped, the war was over in 1945, we were all told that we would have to leave the camps. And at the time that they gave us this notice, my father had been contracted out to Kalamazoo Tomato Nursery. And so, being I was the oldest at home at the time, I had to go to the ad building and tell them that, you know, what are we to do, because we can't move out of the camps because my dad is in Kalamazoo. So they called there, but the man that owned the nursery, that was really a peak period, and he said that he could not release the 15 men that he hired, besides they are on contract. And so my dad wasn't able to come back right away. So it got to the point where these 15 people, including my dad, we were about the last ones to leave camp. And even that, we didn't have a place to go. So when my brother got a furlough from the Army, because I had 3 brothers in service, he came back to the camp and he said, well, you know what? He said, you can't go back to California because the house is gone, the farm is gone. So word of mouth, my dad found out from somebody that was one of the 15 that there was a gentleman named Mr. White that was down in Paynton, Missouri. And he had a big plantation, and he decided, well, these people can come and live here and they can run my farm because I need help. And so my dad said, well, I guess, you know, since we can't go back to California, we'll go to Paynton, Missouri. And we got bused there, and I got out, and I said to my mother, I said, what are we doing back here? We just left the barracks. This man had gone to our camp and bought so many barracks. And so this was our home again. And so, you know, and it's funny because, you know, at that age, being I was the oldest, I had to grow up fast to make decisions because my mom and dad could not speak English well enough to make any kind of decisions, and they weren't citizens at the time. So I had to grow up fast to take care of a lot of the matters. And so I said to my mother, I said, the thing is, I said, we just left this, and I don't think I want to stay here. And she said, I don't think you have a choice. So anyway, we lived in Paynton, and they had never seen an Oriental in this town. So when we started living there, we were a novelty, and people would drive by or they'd walk by and gawk at us. And then when we started going to school, I mean, you know, then, you know, the school kids, they just were not accepting us. And so every morning we'd get on the bus, and there's 2 boys that lived next door to where we lived. And they would always start the ball rolling in the bus, picking on all of us. And you know how, I think, you know, when you read about people that have killed somebody or did something drastic, they go sort of berserk every now and then. And I really believe that the morning that I got on the bus, I must have gone berserk because I stepped up the bus steps and the kids started in on us. And I just stood there screaming and ranting at the bus driver and these kids. And the maddening part of it is, the bus driver never stopped to see what was going on or to even help us. So when we got to school, I said to the bus driver, I said, you know what, the least you could have done was stop the bus and stop these kids from picking on us. This happens every morning going to school, every night coming back from school, and I'm tired of it. Who do I have to see? He said, I have no idea. Well, I don't know what I would have done if he told me to go see somebody. But anyway, he said, I have no idea. He said, you have to take care of your own problems. So after that, I thought, okay, on the way home, they started again, and I decided, okay, I don't know who your mother and father is, but that's where I'm stopping before I go home. So I had warned them. I said, you know, you've done your damage today. Now today I'm going to take care of this. I'm going up to the steps of your mother's house, and I'm going to tell your mother just what kind of kids you are. And the 2 brothers just laughed at me. So then I started up the stairs, and all my friends kept saying, come on, Mary, you can't do that. I said, well, I'm going to do it. I'm going to be heard. I don't know whether they're going to do anything about it, but I said, I'm tired of it. You know, we don't bother the kids. Why are they picking on us? And so anyway, I walked up the steps, and this lady came out, and I said, are you Mrs. Bird? And she said, yes. And I said, well, I just want to tell you what your 2 boys do to us every day. We don't bother the kids on the bus. We don't say anything to them. Yet I said, they're picking on us every day. And I said, I'm just tired of it. Could you talk to your sons? And she was shocked to hear what I had to say, and she said, I will take care of it. My husband will take care of it also. Well, that night, I guess when her husband came home from work, they sat down and they discussed it. And in those days, you know, if you really were bad, you got the strap. And I guess the father used it on the two boys. And the next morning, they were standing on the road waiting for us. And so my friends that were with me said, Mary, you know what? We're really in trouble today because of what you did yesterday. And I said, well, we're going to see what the problem is. Well, it wasn't that we were in trouble. The boys decided to be nice to us. They couldn't have been nicer if they had to be. And I looked at one of the boys and I said, why are you being so sweet? Well, you know what? You ought to see my back. And I said, oh, okay. I said, you know what? I think you deserved it. And the brother did say, he said, well, he got more than I did because he mouthed off. And I said, okay. You don't do that with your parents. You listen to them and you do what they tell you. So, you know, when we left the camps and we faced all this discrimination, and then when one of my other brothers came back to see where we were living, he just decided, you are not going to live here under these conditions. So he had a very good friend that he made friends with when he was in the service. And this gentleman had told him, you know, if you go and see your parents and they need somewhere to go, make sure you call me because my parents will sponsor you people in Flint, Michigan. And so he took us to Flint, Michigan, and the parents did. They found housing for us and they helped us out with the furniture and everything. And so, you know, when we went to school again there, because they have never seen Orientals in Flint, Michigan, again, us kids had to go through the same problems. And then when I got into high school and I thought, you know what, all these problems I'm having and nobody is trusting me, so I'm going to go to the principal or the superintendent and ask them why people are mistreating us, because we don't bother anybody. And so when I went to the superintendent's office, Mr. Thompson said, I didn't know this was going on and I will take care of it. And then the principal got in on the conversation. He said, I will send out a communication. And I said, well, then I said, I might just as well go home today. And so he said, no, no, no. He said, I'm going to send out a communication. This is going to stop. And surprisingly, they started to accept all of us. And then it got to the point where the principal and the superintendent became very good friends with me because they had never seen Orientals either, so they were asking me all the questions about what we're like and what we've been doing and where we're from and all that. So we became very good friends. And when the students all found out that I was such good friends with Mr. Thompson and Mr. Collins, well, now they're really accepting me. You know, they're going to be my friends. And so, you know, it's been a long road for all of us, and especially for the Essays. And then when some of them came out here to Detroit area, they all congregated like in the Cass Corridor area because that was just a lot of apartment houses. And they felt like if they all lived with one another, they would have more security. So today, when I meet my friends that are from the Cass Corridor area, we laugh about it. I always throw that up and yeah, you're from the Cass Corridor. And so I said, why did you people all live there? And they said, well, because we felt like there was enough of us and we'd have more protection. And then I think because of that, all the Niseis, when they moved to suburbs where there were not a lot of Japanese. And so now the Sanseis, they're raised in areas where there were no Japanese. So a lot of the Sanseis do not know Japanese. They do not know how to speak it. They do not eat Japanese food, which is sad. But it's because they were growing up in an American community or, you know, community where there were no Japanese. And so today, the Sanseis, a lot of them do not have any Japanese friends because of that. And so they don't even want to hear about the problems that we had, because my sisters and brothers have tried to speak to them about our experiences and what we went through, and they don't want to hear about it. That's ancient times and, you know, all this. And I keep telling my nieces and nephews, you need to listen to your parents. You know, regardless of what you say, where you live, you're still Japanese descent. And you need to be proud of that, because there's no way you're going to get away from that. I don't care where you live. And, you know, some of them have listened a little way, halfway with me, and some of them just don't want to hear it. They're so used to their American friends that they don't need Japanese friends. And so, you know, eventually the fourth generation probably, they will lose all of our culture. They will not know anything about the Japanese cultures because of the fact that they're growing up in communities where there are no Japanese neighbors or anything. So a lot of times when one of my sisters would complain about it, I would have to tell them, it's not their fault, it's your fault because it's where you moved. You moved in an area where there were no Japanese neighbors. What do you expect of your children? So, you know, it's been a long road for all of us. And I've asked my Nisei friends here in Detroit. I know most of the community people here. And I do come up with these questions every now and then. I ask them, did you tell your kids about your experiences? No. Why aren't you telling them? But we don't want them to know what we went through. Because when we came out of camp, you had nothing. And it was such a struggle. And it's like one of my friends said to me, you know, Mary, it was really below poverty the way we lived. I don't want my kids to know that I went through that. And I said, yeah, but that's nothing to be ashamed of. You survived, and they have to give you credit for that, because it was really hard when we came out of camp. Being we had nothing, we had to earn our way back into society again. And most of the young people that came to Detroit, they were lucky to get a job in a factory. A lot of the women and the men, they were like houseboys and landscapers and maids, and then they went to school at night to get their college education. So now, the Niseis that I know that have children in college, they're doing everything they can so that the kids will get a good education. It's just like the Iseis, when we got out of camp, they insisted that every child go to college because they felt like if we had the education when the war started, maybe we could have avoided going into the camps. And so they stressed that with all of us kids. And then now the Niseis are doing it with their children, and then their children are doing it with their kids, which is the fourth generation. You're going to school regardless. And so, you know, education became such an important part of our life after the war started. And also, one thing that our parents lectured to us all the time was that we have a word called gaman. That word means that you have to put up with what comes your way, overlook a lot, and accept it. And I used to say to my mother, yeah, but you know, why do we have to take all of this? She said, because, she said, you have to. And so the Niseis, as the parents died off, we felt very bad for them. And so when Carter came up with a commission to investigate why we were interned in these camps and why we had to lose everything, they came up with no reason why we had to be interned, because they had found nobody that was guilty of sabotage or espionage, but they did find a few in the American public. And so the commission recommended to Carter that every survivor of the camp needs help and that we should give them redress payments of $25,000 per surviving internee. Of course, when Reagan went in, he refused it. He turned every bill down. So this started in the 70s. So by '88, Reagan decided, because he vetoed every bill, but we had a Japanese senator in Washington from Hawaii, and he thought this is so wrong. So he issued a bill that's called an entitlement. And that bill went through, because when you have an entitlement bill, I understand it's similar to a Social Security bill. So that bill went through, but Reagan said he would approve $20,000 per internee that survived. And the Niseis felt very bad, because by then, majority of the Iseis had passed on. And we really wanted the Iseis to get that money instead of us. But it was unfortunate because, you know, they were up in their age and they had passed on. My mother missed her payment by 2 weeks when she passed away. And I felt very bad for her, because she was the one that was the strong one in our family. my dad, he was sort of a nonchalant person, and it was my mother that was preaching continually to us kids. And so I felt so bad for her, because in 2 weeks, if she had survived, she would have gotten her money, and she could have died a little more happier. But after that, we decided to see this. We finally found out, when the newspapers found out that we were getting this. I think all of you, if you read the Free Press and News, you might have seen articles. People were writing to the editorial upset because we were getting this money. I mean, they didn't know what happened to us. The only thing they were interested in is the payment of the money. And so a lot of people, when I worked at Ford Motor Company, they used to say to me, "Why should you get it?" And I said, "Well, why shouldn't I get it? I lost everything." And I said, "And my parents lost everything. And we had to struggle to get to this point." And they said, "Yeah, but you're doing well." And I said, "Yes, because I made it a point to survive." And so I said, so we got 20,000, but I said, that is not going to do anything for us, because you can't even buy a car for 20,000 today. You can't even buy a home. But I said, at least it's a start for us. So, my coworkers were very unhappy about it, and I said, well, there's nothing I can do about it. So you can call the newspapers, call the TV stations and complain. But they didn't. But gradually, as they found out what happened, then now everybody is coming to be my friend. Because at Ford Motor Company, at the time I got hired in, there were no Japanese girls working there. And my sister and I were in business school in Flint, and Ford Motor Company came and recruited us to work at Ford Motor Company. But when we started, there was so much discrimination, because it was right after the war. I started in 1952, January. So there was a lot of discrimination, and my sister would cry at her desk every day because somebody would say something nasty to her, or they'd pick on her. So I would go over to her and I would say to her, "Why are you crying?" Then she'd cry harder. She couldn't tell me because she's crying so hard. So finally she decided that she would just quit and get married, and that was an easy way out for her. So anyway, I thought, no, I was recruited. I didn't come here asking for a job. I was recruited, so I'm going to stay here. So no matter what the people said to me, I stuck it out. I had an answer for them, and also one day I just decided I would go into the plant manager's office and complain, because I had people following me no matter where I went. Even to go to the ladies' room, somebody would follow me. And I finally went to the plant manager. I said, "Is it because you've instructed these people to do this, because you don't trust me?" And he said, "No way." He said, "I would not instruct anybody to do that to you." But he said, "We're going to take care of this matter." And so anyway, he issued a communication that he will not tolerate any of this. So then people started coming around being my friend. But after a while, these people that did it to me, they would finally come out, and they'd get the nerve to ask me what I was doing at Ford Motor Company. And I said, "The same thing you're doing, pushing a pencil, adding numbers." And they said, "No, but why are you here?" And I said, "Because," I said, "somebody from salary personnel came and recruited me." I said, "I was in school in Flint. I didn't even live in Detroit." They said, "Well, the guy says, I never heard of such a thing, that they went out recruiting people." I said, "Well, they did. That's how I came about coming to Ford Motor Company in Dearborn. I lived in Flint." And so then he realized that, I wasn't part of the war. Because, I think because we were Japanese, they thought that we're all from the old country. You need to go back where you came from. And they blamed everything on us. Anytime anything went down in a slump, it was our fault. And so I finally started speaking up. And I told them, I said, "Why are you blaming all of us? We have nothing to do with Japan." "Well, you all look alike." And I said, "Well, yes, we look alike, but I was born and raised in California. All the Niseis, the second generation, were born and raised here. The only ones from Japan are the first generation, our parents. So why are you blaming us?" Well, it's like you always say, education doesn't hurt anybody. And so all the time I'm working at Ford's, I'm educating my coworkers. And so, I always said to my boss, I know at first when you became my boss, you never really cared for me. I said, I could sense it. So I said, now, how do you feel about me working here? Because you know what? I'm not going anywhere. They're going to have to lay me off before I leave this office. So he said, yeah, Mary, I guess you're not. Because he said, I didn't mean any harm by what I said to you. And I said, well, I don't particularly care for you to talk to me like that. You're talking down to me. And I said, you know, for you to even come into the office the first day you work there, come up to me and say to me, you know, I can't understand why you can speak English so well. And I said, Gary, do you remember what my answer was to you? He said, yeah, I remember it well, because you swore at me. I said, yes, I did. I said, you know, I thought to myself, I've been at Ford's for how many years before you became my boss? And you're a lot younger than I am, and you will not talk to me in that tone of voice. Plus the fact, I said, you know, when you get upset enough, you do use a few words that you shouldn't use. But I said, I thought the only way I was going to get through to you was use a few words, and I did. And I got through to you, and now you understand my position. He said, yes, I do, and I'm sorry. And he always apologized to me about anything he stepped out of line with, because he was in such a habit of stepping out of line, you know, insulting me or saying derogatory remarks. So I said, you know, your problem is, Gary, you do this continually because you live that life. You do it every day, probably, even out in the public. And so I said, you're in such a habit. You can't stop doing that to me. But I said, I will put a stop to it. Because I said, you know, if I have to go to the upper guy, I will. Because I said, I'm tired of it. I said, I put up with a lot. And I said, I don't intend to put up any more with you. And besides, I said, you know, you're like half my age and you don't even know what I'm doing here in this job. You don't even know my job. And I said, you really need me. I don't need you. So, you know, after a while, he would start telling all the managers, you have to talk to my boss out there. She's my boss. I'm not her boss. And they would come in and they'd say to me, you're Gary's boss? And I said, yes, I am. Because I said, he doesn't know what I'm doing. And he doesn't do anything, so I don't need to know what he's doing. So, you know, this is the way I worked with him, to get along with him. And then eventually, he stepped on his boss's toes and he was let go. But anyway, I have always said to people, I go out to universities and high schools and middle schools to speak, and I've always told people that, you know, whenever you do have a problem, you work at it, you can overcome it. And they've always said to me, just yesterday I was at University of Michigan, and 2 girls asked me, how did you people get on your feet? I said, it took a lot, believe me, but I said, we managed. We survived, and I said, that's the bottom line. But I said, you have to work at everything and anything if you run into an obstacle, and you will survive. So, you know, they just thought that was such a miracle that we did. But this is a graveside that is at my camp where I was at in Rohr. The land that our camp was built on is nothing but a corn patch. Some gentleman came in to buy that when the camps closed, so he decided to just raise corn. But the mayor of McGee, Arkansas, which was the next city, she said, you know, she said, as long as I'm mayor here, you will not take this down the graveside. It will stay there, or you will not be growing corn on that land. And so the man that bought it decided, okay, he would just allow that part of the land to stay. So that is our grave site. My mother has 3 friends that are there. Most of the people that were buried there, the kids took the bodies back to California. But these 3 that were left here, that were my mother's friends, the kids could not afford to transport the bodies back there, so they are there. And then there are some children that are buried there. I went back in 1985 just to look to see what the camp was all about. And I discovered that the state of Arkansas has declared it a historical site. And so they are taking care of it. And then I just got word about a month ago from the mayor of McGee. He's a gentleman that was a little boy, and his uncle worked in the camp. And so his uncle used to bring the little boy into the camp. So this gentleman that's the mayor of McGee now knows all about the Rohr camp. And so he decided it was such an important thing for him to do something about it So he got with the state of Arkansas, and they decided they are going to build a museum in McGee in honor of the internees that were there in the camp. And some of the teachers that were there had donated all the collections they had from the camp. And this is what's going to be in the museum. They're planning on building it this year, and they think it will be open by fall. And I'm hoping that I'm able to get there to see it. These are 3 children that are buried there. One is one of my relatives, little boy. And that's the end of it. So, if any of you have any questions.
I have 2 questions, actually. Have you had a chance, they just opened up a museum in the West, maybe one of the Dakotas, which is the reconstruction of one of the internment
Yes,
camps. And I was just wondering, that's my first question, if you've had a chance.
It's in Minidoka. It's Minidoka.
Yeah. And the second question is, when they allowed you to have the general store, what did you use for money? Because no one earned any money, right?
Well, what little we had. And then my mother earned $12 a month. And one story that I will never forget is when I was in camp, you know, we had all these administrative people there and all these MPs that were just running all over the place. And so they brought this lady in, Mrs. Bennett. She was the most beautiful blonde that you would have wanted to see. You would think she was a movie star. She had this little 4-year-old boy, Tommy, and she needed a babysitter for 2.5 hours. So no one would take the job because at that time I thought, babysitting, what do I do? So the block leader approached me and he said, Mary, would you go to the ad building and get interviewed? This lady needs a babysitter badly. So I said, well, yeah, you know, I'll go. So I went and I got hired, and this administrative department head took me to her, and when I saw her, I thought, my goodness, she's such a beautiful lady. And this little boy was like this, and he was almost white-haired, cute little boy. And I asked the lady, what do I have to do to babysit? She said, well, for 2.5 hours, you just have to play with my son. And when it rains, this additional building next to my apartment, you play in there. Oh, well, that was simple enough. So I said, okay. And so I went there every day after school. And you know, and I would be there playing with this little boy, and I'd see all these MPs coming and going and coming and going, one after another. And I would always say, God, she's so popular. And so, you know, I would go home and I would tell my friends, do you know how many men she had coming and going? She's so pretty, and she's got so many men friends. And at that time, you never heard of prostitutes, lesbians, gays, or anything. So nobody knew what was going on. Even my older friends, when I told them, they had no idea. So I said, but you know what? The nice part of it is when I go there, first thing she does is she sets me down with her little boy. We have milk or Kool-Aid and cookies or cake. She baked every day. So I said, that's really nice, you know, that's a treat for me. And then I said, when I leave, I said, I get $2 silver. They said, you do? I said, yes, she gives me $2 silver. And to this day, I have all my silver dollars that she paid me. They're all like in the 1800 silver dollars. And you know, I could make a mint today if I went to peddle these. But I thought, no, I'm going to save them because those are hard to come by. You can get the ones that were made, you know, in recent years that's not silver. This is 100% silver. And so every now and then when I got paid, I would go to the general store and I'd buy all this candy and I'd treat all my friends. And they used to call me the richest girl in the block. And I said, well, why don't you girls go out and go get a job so, you know, you can treat me every now and then. But, I mean, you know, jobs just weren't out there. But I found out after I left the camps, I still didn't know when I was in camp, I came to Michigan. And I was a junior at that time. And in school, one of the teachers was talking about all this bad stuff that's going on. And when she said prostitute, I had to raise my hand and ask her, what is that? And she said, oh, these ladies that are in business. And so she said, why do you ask? Do you know somebody that's a prostitute? I said, well, I think I babysat for a prostitute. And she said, well, why would you do that? And I said, well, I was in camp. And I said, she needed a babysitter for 2.5 hours. So I said, all I had to do was play with the little boy. And so, you know, I said, and then she paid me well. So she said, I can't believe this, that you didn't know you were working for a prostitute. I said, well, when you're like 11, 12, 13, what do I know about prostitutes? And she said, well, how did you find out? And I said, because through school. And then I said, I used to go and tell all my friends. She's such a beautiful woman, and you should see all the men friends she has. And even at that, none of my friends knew what I was talking about. And so as we got older, and I still keep in touch with some of my friends that are still alive, we laugh about my job as a prostitute. So whenever she says, well, gee, I called you the other day, where were you? Babysitting for a prostitute. And I said, yeah, I was. Why? There's good money in it. But we laugh about it because for 3 years I did that, and I didn't know I was babysitting for a prostitute.
And have you been to that camp out west, that the museum?
Minidoka?
Yeah, have you?
No, because I wasn't in that camp.
Right.
I have friends here that live in Royal Oak that went to that.
And what do they think of it?
And they thought it was great that they were building this museum.
Yeah.
And so now in Roar, where I was at, this mayor is going to initiate the state to build this museum. And he's already got the funding. So now what he wants me to do is find some people here in the Detroit area or Chicago or Ohio, in the Midwest area that were in camp. And a lot of the people that were in that camp are in like Chicago and Ohio and in Detroit area. A lot of them that I knew of in Detroit have passed on. But I still have a few friends here that are from Roar, and we're planning on getting together and going down there if we can. And I said, well, we'll probably have to get on a bus or something. And they said, well, why? And I said, because it's a long distance from here to Arkansas. We'd have to stay overnight somewhere and all. But I said, I'm willing to drive if you guys want to go. But, you know, we have to take turns driving. But my friends have got a lot of ailments and they're not able to drive anymore. So I said, well, you know, if we can get enough people here, maybe we can go on a bus.
You have a question, Becky? While you were at the camp, did your parents ever try to explain to you why you
Can't hear what she's saying.
When you were at the camp, did your parents ever
I'm sorry?
try to explain why you were there?
Yeah.
Did they explain why you had been interned?
No, they never told us anything in these camps. And on top of that, our parents always said, don't ask questions because we could get in trouble. So our kids really never asked questions. They never asked questions because they were afraid of what might happen to them. And they always said it would have been fine if they interned the parents because we weren't citizens. But they were permanent aliens here, but they weren't citizens. And so they said it would have been fine if they just took all the Eastsays and put them in camp. But why take my kids? But they were so afraid of what would happen to us, so they always told us kids, don't ask questions. And they never gave us any information anyway. And so this is why when our leaders in Washington, I have quite a few friends that in Washington, they're senators and House of Representative people. And they decided with our organization, our national headquarters in San Francisco, that we have to do something about this. Because now all the parents are living with their kids. They're crammed in these little apartments. It was nothing for 3 families to live at Cass Corridor in like a 1-bedroom apartment because they had nowhere else to go. And this is a reason why they don't like to speak about it. They don't want their kids to know it. And I said, you know, that's true. I said, probably if I had children, I'm sure I would tell them because I'm just that kind of a person. But I said, you know, I said, it just isn't right for you parents not to tell your children because this is such a big part of history for them. Maybe non-Japanese could care less, but I said, for the Japanese person, you need to know this because your ancestors went through all of this. And so, you know, the Niseis just do not want to talk about it. And all my friends here in Detroit have said that to me. We don't tell our kids because we're embarrassed.
Pam,
Two books to be read in book group. One was Snowballing on Cedars. The other is
What?
Corner of Bitter and Sweet. Talked about Japanese internment. Are you familiar with those
What?
Two books that have been published, stories about the Japanese-American internment experience. Snow Falling on Cedar and Hotel in the Corner of Bittersweet. Are you aware of either of those books? And
No.
Are they accurate?
I have no idea, because the only books that I'm interested in is what is published about us. We have quite a few books.
So strictly nonfiction, and these were novels.
Yeah. We have quite a few books that Japanese Americans have published. And these are people that have been in different camps. So every camp was built identical. We had the same type of ruling, but there was a little difference in every camp. I mean, some camps, they had real nice people that never rioted. But most of the camps, they did have little riots because, you know, when you're like 17, 18 and you have nothing to do but just sit in your room without any furniture or anything, you're going to get awfully tired of it, and you're going to lose your temper. And this is what happened. These young fellows would lose their temper, and wherever they went, they'd pick an argument. Mm-hmm. But like I said, MPs were always floating around in our camp, so you couldn't really get away with too much.
We have a question in the back.
You talked about going to this mess hall or whatever to have meals. Did they accommodate your Japanese
Did they?
diet?
I'm sorry?
What kind of meals did they provide?
Well, I'll tell you, down in Arkansas, I'm assuming that they raised a lot of lamb, because every meal that we had was lamb fixed in one way or another. So today, you couldn't even pay me to eat an expensive lamb chop. I just refused to eat it. I have a sister that ate lamb chops all the time because she loved lamb chop. She would cook and she'd tell me, have this, because you know what? She said, it's really good. And I said, what is it? She said, it's lamb. And I said, forget it. I might have gotten sick on lamb. I don't know why I turned so much against it. But today, you could not give me any form of lamb cooked in any way to eat. You couldn't even pay me to eat it. And also, we had a lot of hash. They said it was corned beef hash, but now that I think back, we had more potatoes in it than we did hash. There was really not much meat in it. So that's another thing that I don't eat today. I was just out for breakfast the other day with a friend, and she said, Mary, they have corned beef hash and eggs. I said, well, la-di-da. And she said, well, that's what I'm going to have. She said, don't you want to have it? She said, you can't find too many restaurants that have corned beef and hash with eggs. I said, good, you can have my share, because I said I don't eat corned beef hash. And she wanted to know why. And when I told her, she was shocked, because she had never heard about the camps and what happened to us. So I said, well, Margot, you and a zillion other people haven't heard about it, so I said, I'm glad I mentioned something that you learned today.
Charmin?
I would just like to mention that we've talked about Japanese Americans passing the stories on to their children. I think it's really important for white Americans to pass the stories on so we can make sure that this never happens again. And I also would like to recommend a book that my Japanese American friends tell me is a very accurate description, in which I found very moving. It's called When the Emperor Was Divine, and it depicts the Japanese American family who had to move to a camp. Have you ever heard of that book, Mary?
No, I don't read that much, but when I do read, it's always buying the books that these internees have written, because they're all from different camps. You won't find a lot of people like in Roar to write a book like that.
Well, and you lived it, so you don't.
Yeah, I lived it, so I don't even want to read it.
We need to understand.
And so, people have said to me, but you know what? Can you come back again? And I said, well, even if I came back, I'd have to skim over the top, because it takes days to tell you from the beginning to the end if I really went into detail. I said, it's just too time consuming, so I said, I usually skim over the top of everything that I talk about. And so I'm not really getting into detail. But I said, if you want to, I said, every February, a documentary comes out, Farewell to Manzanar. And they have it in February because that is the anniversary of the Executive Order 9066. In fact, a lot of the organizations here commemorate that date. We have I belong to different organizations, and we do that among ourselves. And so, you know, if you get a chance to, in February, if you see that documentary on TV, watch it. Because, of course, you will see some of the barracks that I show you. But it's really a story about a gentleman that goes back from one of these camps that they took. You know, when the war started, the FBI just went into homes of leaders, church leaders and everything, just knocked the doors down and just confiscated everything and took the men with them. And so Crystal City, Texas is one of them. And my uncle in Stockton was a community leader, and he was taken there. And I guess they really put them through a lot of interrogation, because most of the people that come out of this camp, they don't want to talk. The families have an awful time trying to communicate with them because they just won't talk. And so, like my uncle, when he came back, he didn't come back while they were in camp. They released him after the camps, after the war ended. And when he got home, the two boys said he wouldn't even talk to us. He wouldn't talk to his wife, he wouldn't talk to his daughter. He just nodded his head. And I said, well, maybe he couldn't speak. And they said, no, he could, but he just didn't want to talk about his experience in the war. And so I said, I can't imagine what goes on in these places that creates that. And so this picture, Farewell to Manzanar, has a little bit of that in there. This gentleman comes out of one of the camps like that. There were two of them, and I can't remember where the other one was, but Crystal City, Texas was a very popular place for these people.
Another question?
How about all of your family's investments or bank accounts? Was all of that seized? Did you lose?
I'm sorry?
All of that? Did you lose all of your financial accounts and everything that you had financially? Was it all seized by the government?
Well, I'll tell you, some people did have their assets frozen. And why, we don't know. It had to be selected people. But for most of the Issei's that were farmers, they really didn't have that much money. And my mother is one of these. She'd been through the Depression. And I didn't know that until one day I saw her down in the cellar. And she had this wad of money and she's burying it. And I said, Mom, what are you doing? She said, well, we don't put our money in the bank, Mary. We went through the Depression and lost everything. So she said, I just hide it in this place. And I said, yes, but if somebody came and robbed us, you'd lose all the money. And she said, well, they'll never find it where I hide it. And so I stood there and I thought, what is she going to do, dig a hole? Because, you know, I had heard of people digging holes and putting cans in there, you know, and this was not the Japanese people, there were other nationalities. And so I thought this is what she was going to do, but no. You know, the Japanese people eat a lot of rice. And so when we bought rice in California, you bought 100 pounds of rice, you know, just to buy quantity. So most of the people that did buy quantity had big metal cans that they put it in, and I guess it stayed fresher, because when you open the bags and while you're using it, I guess it got stale. So she put hers in these big cans. And while I stood there watching her, here she is digging through this big can of rice. I said, Mom, what are you doing? She said, well, nobody will look in this can of rice to find money, so I'm hiding it in the rice can. She had it in a plastic bag, wrapped up real well, and here she stuck it at the bottom of the rice can. I said, so Mom, you know what? In other words, if we wanted a few dollars, you know, in an hour or so, you'd have to come down here and dig through that can of rice to get us the money. She said, right. She said, I have a lot of time, I can do it. But you know, this is what a lot of the Issei's did. And it's funny because my friends and I, we kid around whenever we talk about banking and the fees and all. And Margot just said to me, you know, Mary, I'm so sick and tired of these fees that they're charging me. I had a check that came back, and she said, didn't even know I was short funded, but anyway, she had to pay $35. She said, I have half a notion to just hide my money. I said, where are you going to hide it? She said, I don't know, I got to find out where to hide it. But she said, I'm tired of paying these fees. And so I laughed at her and I said, John, now you sound like my parents. And she said, well, where did your parents hide it? And I said, well, you probably have never seen such quantity of rice that we used to buy. I said, we had metal cans that we put it in instead of leaving it in the sacks to keep it fresh. I said, she actually took her money and hid it at the bottom of this pile of rice. I said, I stood there and watched her. I couldn't figure out what she was doing. And she said, you know, Mary, from knowing you, because she's been my neighbor at the condominium for about 8 years, from knowing you and being with you all the time, I have to assume that you were sort of a troublemaker and you were one of these that had to know everything going on. I said, you hit it right on the nose. Because I said, I'm still that way. I feel like if you don't ask questions, you don't learn anything. And so I said, I do ask a lot of questions, and I do a lot of things that I shouldn't be doing the way I was brought up. And my mother had always said to me, I have 10 children, and I think you're the biggest headache of my life. And I said, oh, sure, Mom, but I said, you depend on me for everything. You made me grow up so fast. That's why I'm so independent, and I don't want to be bothered with people. I said, I take care of things myself.
I think on that note, a lot of us can find commonality because I'm sure many of us have heard that woman who gave us life say, you're a headache. I want to thank you for sharing a remarkable story with incredible candor and some wonderful pictures. I know that you have all been sitting quite a while. Mary will be here still for a while. Feel free to chat with her some more and converse with each other. I think there's probably a few cookies left in the back. I hope that this story helps you to tell your stories to your children, because there were some themes there about being ashamed to tell a family story, to want, as my family said, to leave a lump under the rug, because sometimes we think we're so different. But I think we all have incidences and ancestries that aren't perfect, that have shown challenges, and that show real fortitude.
And I think all the immigrants that came here,
Yes.
they came looking for a better life, but I don't think they found that life being so easy. They had to work hard. And I often wondered how my mom and dad raised 10 kids and educated us. But, you know, they always said they would do anything for the sake of the children. That's one of their sayings. And also this word gaman, which means, you know, accept it and forget about it, turn your back and all that. So those are two things that they preached to us. And then after the war, the third thing they preached that was more important than anything else was your education.